The Grand Senate Chamber of Viora was an architectural marvel, suspended high above the planet's surface, with towering spires and walls of shimmering crystal. The chamber was designed to reflect the grandeur of the empire it represented, a vast interstellar dominion that spanned hundreds of worlds. It was a place of immense power, where the fate of entire species was decided by the galaxy's most influential beings. Yet, for all its beauty and majesty, the atmosphere in the Senate chamber on that day felt heavy, charged with an undercurrent of tension. At the heart of the chamber stood Emperor Darius, ruler of the Vioran Empire. The emperor's appearance was regal, almost otherworldly, draped in robes that shimmered with intricate designs of gold and silver, signifying the power of his bloodline. His every movement seemed to radiate authority, and the senators who filled the grand hall, alien beings from countless different species, hung on his every word. His voice, deep and commanding, echoed through the chamber as he spoke of the future of the galaxy. He spoke with the conviction of a man who believed himself invincible, the supreme ruler of a galaxy that had bowed to him for centuries. His speech was filled with promises of stability, control, and the continued dominance of his empire. But it was also laced with subtle dismissals of those who dared to question his rule. The emperor's words were a polished performance, meant to remind everyone in the room of the Vioran Empire's might and the emperor's unchallenged position at the helm of that power. His speech was masterful in its delivery, filled with rhetoric that painted the galaxy as a place where the weak would either bow or be crushed under the might of his forces. The senators, a mix of the galaxy's most powerful species, listened intently, nodding in agreement, some offering polite applause at intervals. The room was silent between Darius' words, but that silence was not one of peace. It was one of submission. The senators were not there to discuss or debate. They were there to listen and obey. Darius was the center of their universe, and they knew it. Among the crowd, however, one figure stood apart. His name was Theo, a human, though few in the Senate chamber would have called him remarkable. He was a low-level diplomat, a clerk who had been sent to the Senate by the Terran delegation. His role was insignificant: paperwork, managing communications, ensuring the human colony's interests were minimally represented. He was not a soldier, not a senator, not even an ambassador. He was just another human, one of the many whose species had only recently arrived on the galactic stage. To the Virans and other species, humans were still considered newcomers, their place in the galaxy uncertain. They were seen as raw, unrefined, untested in the galaxy's complex political games. For most of the galaxy, humans were little more than a curiosity, useful for trade or labor, but not to be taken seriously in matters of power. Theo had been seated near the back of the chamber, his eyes cast downward, his mind wandering as Darius continued with his speech. He could feel the weight of the Emperor's words, the oppressive certainty in them. The Emperor spoke of a future where human influence would remain negligible, where humans would continue to be treated as inferior, their voices unimportant. Darius made it clear that the Viorans and their allies would continue to shape the future, leaving humans to follow the will of the galaxy's true rulers. But it was the way Darius spoke, his tone, his dismissive gestures, the way he belittled those who challenged his empire, that ignited something in Theo. It wasn't just the words themselves, but the arrogance with which they were delivered. The Emperor's words weren't just a statement of power. They were a declaration of humanity's place at the bottom of the galaxy's hierarchy. Theo shifted in his seat, feeling a tightening in his chest. He had heard these sentiments before, but something about today felt different. Perhaps it was the look of contempt in the Emperor's eyes when he mentioned humans, or the smugness with which he dismissed any human contributions. Whatever it was, Theo could feel his heart pounding. The longer he sat there, the more he felt the anger rise inside him, a bubbling pressure he couldn't ignore. He was just one man, and in this room, he was nothing. He wasn't even supposed to be here. His people had only recently begun to carve out a place in the galaxy, and they were still treated as little more than an afterthought. But as the Emperor's voice droned on, as the senators nodded and murmured in agreement, something inside Theo snapped. He wasn't just a clerk, a paper pusher. He was a human, a representative of his people, and he had had enough. Enough of the condescension, enough of the dismissals, enough of the quiet mocking that had always followed humanity wherever it went. This wasn't just a Senate meeting, this was a moment, and Theo knew it. He wasn't sure what exactly he was going to do, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going to sit there any longer and be invisible. With sudden clarity, Theo stood up. The movement was small, barely noticeable, but it was enough to break the spell that had bound the room. Every head turned. The murmurs of the senators died, and all eyes were on him. It wasn't because Theo was important. It was because he wasn't. He was just a human, a lowly representative with no power. His presence in the room, a room where only the most influential beings of the galaxy were meant to have a voice, was an anomaly, and that alone made him stand out. He didn't belong here. He knew that, and everyone in the room knew that. And yet, despite the weight of all their gazes on him, he didn't falter. His feet moved, unbidden, carrying him forward, past the rows of alien delegates, past the glittering pillars of the chamber, until he reached the center where Emperor Darius stood. Theo's hands were trembling, but his mind was clear. He had no plan, no strategy, no backup. He was just a man with a single burning desire: to be seen, to show that humans were more than the Emperor's words, more than the fleeting echoes of a species that had been pushed aside for too long. The Emperor continued speaking, oblivious to the human who was now standing directly before him. Theo could feel his chest rising and falling with each breath, could feel the weight of history pressing down on him. The Emperor had no idea what was coming, but Theo did. The room was deathly quiet. Even the hum of the chamber's engines seemed to cease, as if the entire galaxy was holding its breath. Theo stared up at Darius, who was now looking at him with a mixture of surprise and disdain. The Emperor's eyes narrowed, but there was something else there too. Something almost imperceptible. Something like uncertainty. Theo didn't wait for the Emperor to speak. He simply moved forward, his hands gripping the Emperor's robes. It wasn't an act of violence, it was an act of defiance. And in that moment, Theo became more than just a man in a room full of powerful beings. He became the symbol of something greater, the symbol of humanity's refusal to be forgotten. The room fell into stunned silence as Theo dragged the Emperor across the Senate floor. The tension in the Senate chamber was palpable as Theo, with a surge of determination, grabbed Emperor Darius by his regal robes and began to pull him across the polished, gleaming floor. The room, which had once been filled with murmurs of approval and polite nods, fell completely silent, the kind of silence that signals both awe and disbelief. The Emperor, a being of immense power and prestige, who had ruled the galaxy with an iron fist, found himself in an unthinkable position, dragged across the floor of his own Senate chamber by a mere human. The senators, who had spent years currying favor with the Emperor, were left stunned, their mouths agape, eyes wide, unsure of how to react. The unexpectedness of the act sent ripples of unease through the chamber, as if time itself had briefly stopped. Darius, his once unshakable composure now cracked, stood frozen for a fraction of a second, his sharp, icy eyes locked onto Theo, filled with disbelief. How could this insignificant creature, this human, dare to touch him? How could someone so beneath him in every way think they had the right to challenge his authority? The Emperor's lips parted and his eyes narrowed, the fury within him beginning to surface. This was an affront beyond anything he had ever imagined. There had been rebellion before, but this was different. There had never been anyone so bold, so audacious, as to physically challenge him in front of the entire Senate. The humiliation surged through Darius's veins like fire, fueling his rage. The Emperor's voice boomed through the chamber as he finally found his words. "Enough!" he thundered. But it was a command not directed at Theo, but at the very air around him, as if his words could make the scene disappear. His voice, which had once commanded planets, had lost its usual authority. It wavered, betraying a hint of panic. Theo, undeterred by the Emperor's outburst, continued to pull him across the Senate floor, his grip on the Emperor's robes unwavering. The senators, still paralyzed in shock, watched as the Emperor's dignity seemed to unravel with each step. Some looked on with wide eyes, unsure whether to intervene or allow the human to finish what he had started. Others muttered under their breaths, exchanging glances, unsure how this breach of protocol would be handled. For the first time in centuries, the Emperor was not the most powerful being in the room. Theo's actions were not an act of violence. They were the manifestation of a silent, burning defiance. His hands, though trembling, held firm on the Emperor's robes. His muscles screamed with the effort, but the emotion that propelled him forward was stronger than any physical pain. Every step he took was a reminder, both to himself and to the galaxy, that humans were not insignificant. They were not to be dismissed or belittled. They had been pushed aside for too long, regarded as weak, unworthy of true influence. But Theo was not just dragging an emperor across the Senate floor. He was dragging humanity's future into the light. The senators, many of whom had been so quick to dismiss the Terran delegation in the past, were now witnessing the symbol of that very humanity defying the Emperor himself. The chamber, once filled with murmurs of approval for the Emperor's speeches, now buzzed with a different kind of energy, one that bordered on disbelief and confusion. No one knew how to respond. The Virans were known for their pride, for their belief in their superiority. For centuries, they had ruled the galaxy, their power unchallenged. Yet here was a human, a species that had only recently entered the galactic fold, doing the unthinkable. The Emperor's dignity, his image as the supreme leader of the galaxy, was crumbling with every stride Theo made. The senators, who had sworn loyalty to Darius and his empire, could do nothing but watch. They had no instructions for this moment, no protocol for what to do when a lowly human challenged the Emperor in such a public way. Theo's thoughts were a blur as he continued to pull the Emperor, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He was not a soldier, not a fighter. He was a clerk, a diplomat. Someone who had spent his days behind a desk, never imagining that he would one day find himself at the center of such a monumental act. But now, here he was, dragging an emperor across the floor of the Senate. The weight of it all was overwhelming, but his conviction kept him moving. With every step, the senators and the emperor's own personal guards seemed to shrink further away. They were not intervening. No one was stopping him. For the first time, the human stood unopposed in the Senate, the once untouchable emperor, reduced to a symbol of the old order, a broken icon of a fading power. Finally, with a grunt, Theo halted in the center of the chamber. The emperor's feet dragged to a stop, his expression a mix of fury and disbelief. Theo, his body trembling with exhaustion, let go of the emperor's robes, stepping back to give the man space. The room was eerily quiet now, the sound of Darius's breathing the only thing breaking the stillness. The emperor stood, straightening his robes with a shaking hand, his face flushed with anger. His pride had been shattered, and in that moment, something deeper stirred within him. The realization that he, the ruler of the galaxy, had been physically moved by a human, a species he had always looked down upon, sank deep into his core. It was not just the physical act itself that stung. It was the symbolism of it all. The Emperor had been reduced to nothing more than a pawn in a game he hadn't even realized had started. Darius opened his mouth, ready to unleash a tirade, but his voice faltered. His usual commands, his threats, his speeches, none of it felt right in this moment. The power that had once flowed so easily from him seemed distant, slipping through his fingers like sand. He tried to regain control, but the room no longer bent to his will. It was as if the very air in the chamber had changed, and for the first time, Darius realized he was no longer the unquestioned ruler. The senators, once loyal to him, were now witnesses to his downfall. Theo, a mere human, had done the impossible. He had pulled the Emperor across the Senate floor and, in doing so, had pulled back the curtain on the old order. And in that instant, everything shifted. The Empire, the Senate, the galaxy, they were no longer as they had been. The moment had been small, but it had been enough. Theo had not just defied an emperor. He had defied a system, a belief that humanity would always be subjugated. And in doing so, he had struck the first blow in a war that was not yet fought, but was already beginning to take shape. The galaxy would remember this day, not for the emperor's speeches, but for the human who dared to drag an emperor across the Senate floor. The moment hung in the air like a breath held too long, suffocating the Senate chamber with its gravity. Darius, the once unchallenged ruler of the galaxy, stood at the center of the room, his pride in tatters. The weight of his humiliation was felt by every senator, every guard, and every being present. The emperor, whose speeches had inspired planets, and whose command had bent the galaxy to his will, found himself standing in stunned silence. Theo, a human diplomat, stood at a respectful distance, his body still shaking from the exertion of hauling the Emperor across the Senate floor. His task, however, was far from over. With every eye fixed on him, Theo knew that the galaxy would never be the same again. What had been an unthinkable act moments ago was now a symbol of defiance, a spark that could ignite the flames of rebellion across the stars. The room was thick with tension as Darius, though seemingly defeated, was not broken. His fists clenched, the fury in his eyes rising, but there was no way to mask the vulnerability he now felt. The senators, who had once lived in fear of his wrath, no longer seemed so intimidated. The realization that their emperor was no longer invincible spread through the room like wildfire. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, exchanging furtive glances, while others seemed to shrink back from the emperor, uncertain of how to react. A few of them, once loyal to Darius without question, now began to question everything. What did it mean to serve a ruler who had been so publicly humbled? Could they continue to bow to a leader who had been so thoroughly challenged by a human? Theo, for his part, did not allow himself to become distracted by the shifting dynamics in the room. His task was not yet complete. He had made a statement, but that statement needed to be heard across the galaxy. The Emperor's humiliation was not the end of this battle. It was only the beginning. Theo had done something unprecedented, something that no human before him had dared to even consider. But in the face of it all, he realized that his actions had sent a message much greater than he had ever anticipated. The power structures that had governed the galaxy for millennia were no longer as invulnerable as they had seemed. And this realization struck deep into the hearts of those in the room. The silence was broken when a lone senator, seated at the far end of the chamber, stood up. His name was Senator Jelen, a seasoned politician known for his neutrality in matters of intergalactic diplomacy. He had never openly challenged the Emperor before, but now, his voice rang out with surprising clarity. "This act," he began, his voice steady, "is not just a challenge to the Emperor. It is a challenge to all of us." His words echoed through the chamber, and for the first time since the Emperor's fall, the senators began to stir. "We, the Senate, must decide whether we will continue to serve an emperor who has proven himself fallible, or if we will stand alongside the human who has shown us what true courage looks like." Jellen's statement hung heavily in the air, and it felt as if the galaxy itself was holding its breath. There was a brief, tense pause before another senator, a woman named Tessa, spoke up. She was a rising star in the Senate, known for her progressive views and her willingness to challenge the status quo. "I agree with Senator Jelen," she said, her voice firm but not without hesitation. "For too long, we have allowed the Emperor's power to go unchecked. We have lived under the illusion of his infallibility, but today we have witnessed that he is just as human as the rest of us. Perhaps it is time for the Senate to reclaim its power." Her words ignited a ripple of murmurs throughout the room. Some senators nodded in agreement, while others exchanged nervous glances, unsure of how far this rebellion would go. Darius, who had been listening in silence, now spoke, his voice trembling with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "You all dare to question me?" he spat, his words laced with venom. "I am the Emperor. I have led this galaxy for decades, and you, a group of disloyal senators, think you can strip me of my power. You think a mere human can challenge my authority?" His voice grew louder, shaking with the weight of his fury. He was not ready to let go of the power he had fought so hard to claim. But the more he shouted, the more the room seemed to close in around him. His words, once feared, now felt hollow and impotent. Theo stood there, watching the Emperor's outburst with a sense of detached clarity. He had no personal vendetta against Darius, no desire to see the Emperor brought low. But the actions of the Emperor had caused countless suffering across the galaxy. Entire worlds had been enslaved, entire populations had been crushed under his rule. It was not just the Emperor's pride that had been damaged. It was the lives of countless innocents, and as much as Darius raged, there was no denying the fact that the Emperor's reign had come to an end. His time was over. The galaxy no longer feared him in the same way it once had. One by one, the senators stood, and a new debate began to take shape. There were those who still held fast to their loyalty to Darius, but they were in the minority. The tide had shifted. The realization that the Emperor's power was no longer absolute spread through the room like wildfire. With each passing moment, the Emperor's position grew weaker. For the first time in his life, Darius felt truly alone. The Senate, once his obedient tool, was no longer at his beck and call. The realization that his grip on the galaxy had been loosened, that he was no longer invulnerable, struck him harder than any weapon ever could. Theo, meanwhile, remained focused on his mission. His actions had not been an attempt to destroy Darius. They had been an attempt to awaken the galaxy to the reality of its situation. The time for fear, for subjugation, was over. Humanity had a place in this galaxy, and it was a place of power. He had made a choice to take a stand, to show the universe that the Emperor, despite his vast power, was not above the will of the people. The rebellion had already begun, but this was only the first spark. The tension in the Senate chamber continued to build as the debate raged on. Senator Jelen and Tessa led the charge for reform, while those still loyal to Darius clung to the old ways. But the Emperor's presence had become a ghost in the room. He was no longer the leader. He was the symbol of a fading empire. His once unchallenged rule was slipping away, and as the senators debated, they knew the galaxy was at a crossroads. The world had seen the impossible, and from that moment on, everything had changed.